gives me great pleasure to introduce a friend and neighbor, a kindred spirit, landscape ethicist and philosopher, photographer extraordinaire, and global plant collector, Rick Darke. Rick is author of the classic books, The American Woodland Garden and the Encyclopedia of Grasses for Livable Landscapes, among others. His writing and images have been featured in collaborative works, including the recent Rizzoli book, Falling Water, and Thames and Hudson's On the High Line, Exploring America's Most Original Urban Park. Rick has actually, in addition to the books available at the front of the conference venue, Rick has brought some of his other books here for sale at his cost, if you're interested. So they're up here when he's finished talking. Without further ado, here is Rick Darke.
Thank you, Annette. I'm untethered here. I've got a little radio remote, so all I'm going to do is stay in touch with my clock. Mike, would you take that down the next level? It wasn't going to be that dark. It's kind of like one of those dissolve through black routines. I want to talk to you about emerging ecologies. How many of you use that phrase? Okay, good. How many of you know what a cultural landscape is? Okay, that there is even a foundation for such things. You're in one, you'll be in one all day long. This is a romp through philosophy, through science, through art, through a bit of ecology, looking at some of the things that I think we do need to look at as we imagine how we might play meaningful, useful, enjoyable roles in the broad landscape that we share. That's a helicopter shot 2 miles from here. So you get in a Bell Ranger and you get Harry Griffith south of Newark to fly you. You put your belt on tightly, take the rear doors off, put the craft in a circle so that you can shoot straight down out a rear door. And that is the creek. That is this creek right here. You're in the White Clay watershed. My wife, who is right here, and I deliberately live here. Annette, Donald, Jeffrey, so many people, Dale, live here because we live near this kind of land. This was originally going to be dammed. And Tim, I know in the library has, and Rebecca have a bumper sticker going back to the time that the company was planning on damming the White Clay Valley. They printed up black and orange bumper stickers that said, "Don't dam it," and they defeated that. And so we have more than 6,000 acres of walkable land now that grew from that original 1,100 acres. Emerging ecologies. We are in a time when, if there's anything that is a constant, it is the accelerating pace of change. It's the only thing we can count on. That's discomforting to humans because most humans really like things to get there and stay there. Of course, they never do. Now, we've been using this word a lot. It's actually in the conference title. And it's in a lot of the other presentations, and I grew up with it. How many of you grew up with the word nature? Okay. But you know, this is not the popular view yet, and I want to be nice, but I love the idea, but it's what gets us in trouble. The whole idea, the construct of nature as we know it, is constantly, it's got us crossing our I's and dotting our T's. It has us confused. We think about it, we don't realize it's built upon a construct that talks about a dichotomy. It's, you know, the old trope is man and nature, right? So we're not part of it. Nature is this other, it's like the cloud. How many of you use the cloud? Can you point to it? Right, it's up there, right? Just like nature. It's out there. It's this other thing. It thinks, it does stuff, fixes everything when we make a mess. It's not true. It is a lovely idea. I took 75,000 color slides. This is stuff called film, where you put chemicals on it and then you expose it to light and then you do other dirty things to it and you wind up with something that's transparent and can put color up on the screen. I switched to digital 12, 13 years ago, because I could see where it was going, but I occasionally will scan a slide. There are a couple of scanned slides in here, and I don't care for it because you usually wind up getting dust and little specks and digital artifacts in there. So, with that as background, what's the dot that was above the T? That's right. It's a great blue heron. That bird's got a 5-foot wingspan. It's flying 50 feet above the creek and 300 feet below our craft. Doug Tallamy and I, thank God, we just got a book into a publisher 2 days early, a month ago. This photograph is going to be in there. We actually used it to position a new definition of native, which is related to nature and all kinds of other tricky language. But I wanted to use the photograph because I thought it said, without any language, system. It says complexity. And part of the reason to focus on the dot is that it talks about scale. And too often, we just don't grapple very well with scale. Now, here's a proper dot on an I. And this is what I've been doing for a while, just training myself to use the definition of nature that I've found. And if you read Barry Lopez or you read Ann Whiston Spurn and you look at the people that have dealt with the language of landscape, I think probably the simplest, smartest suggestion came from Raymond Williams in a book about 1981 called Ideas of Nature. He said, nature is just a singular term for the multiplicity of things and living processes. How many of you could live with that? How many of you can't live with that? Because we're going to have a debate later this afternoon. It's taking the dichotomy out of it. For one, he's actually pointing out the fact that Western culture seems to have a need for one term that does this. Many cultures don't. It's a trick. Try it for a day or start for an hour. Just maybe for the afternoon. Don't use the word nature. Just try to say what you mean. Just talk about exactly what it is that's in front of you. Maybe it is just a landscape with water and a bird and trees and insects and springtails in the leaves. Annette told me that there could be a few interactive portions to this presentation. So here's the first one. You're back in the air. It's a different season, okay? How many of you know what this is? Water bug, all right, that's one. Actually, water bugs are actually a different thing, but you're right, it's an insect. Charlie, what is it? It's a water strider. Water bugs are actually different genus, and Doug Tallamy could tell you all about that. It's a water strider. Now, before I tell you more about water striders, you have 10 seconds to memorize this image. Water striders have micro hairs. They don't have feet, but if they did, the hairs would be on their feet, which would be at the end of their legs. They do have legs. And this is a photograph taken, again, about 2 miles from here, looking into the water. And you saw how they can go around the top of the water. They also create these really wonderful shadows. So I was looking at them because Melinda and I walk the creek often. We have a dog that loves to swim. You get down there and you see these in many different seasons. And I was thinking, wow, you know, here's this little being that can walk on water. I mean, human beings have been wanting to do this for a long time. And so I'm thinking, I'd like to be a water strider. But then I look at all this stuff that's on the surface of the water, and I'm thinking, the cost to being a being that can walk on water is that you go out there with your micro hairs, and what they do is they spread the weight out so that there's no one point that breaks the surface tension of the water. That's how you do this. It's all trickery, but it works. So I'm thinking, oh no, you go out there, you start off the morning presumably with clean feet, and by halfway through the day, there's so much of this little organic debris stuck to your micro hairs, It's like going out in mud season with your wellies on. So that, I'm thinking, all right, now I don't want to be a water strider. And then I think, well, is that really what's happening? There's actually nothing stuck to the microhairs on their feet. I've misled you deliberately. When you have this little depression in the water, you're not breaking the surface tension, but you are making a dimple. And that dimple becomes a convex mirror. And each one of these feet is making a convex mirror, and each one of them is showing you the 100-foot tall trees that are overhead. Those are pictures of the scale of the forested landscape, and that's what you're looking at. The point here is about scale, and again, you want to bring up somebody like Leopold. There is so much complexity to these systems that we're dealing with. We will never know all about them. We will never be able to intervene so wisely that we create exactly what we're intending to create, but we can move more in that direction than we are now. We have to, first of all, recognize the complexity and understand that it is constantly changing. I did this book. It's out in the lobby about 10 years ago. I was pleased at the time that the publisher, Timber Press, was willing to publish a book that was really basically about ecology framed in a design book. But it was about things like this, pictures with no flowers, pictures of broken trees and wiggly things and bent things. And it was trying to say, it was at the core of the book is a study that's now 30 years this year, studying one section of the Red Clay Creek. This is about 15 miles from here, that I crossed on my way to Longwood each day at the time when I first started this in 1983. And looking at how the framing of this landscape, actually, if Donna will allow me to say that landscapes without bricks and mortar do have architecture, and trying to understand how that might be used to draw lessons for people that design and manage and steward. So that is a scan slide. It's done on a drum scanner. It's Kodachrome from 1983 in March. I took that and using a carousel slide projector, put it up on the wall and put it into a sketch. And then I actually did go out and do, with a measuring wheel, I did an inventory of all the vegetation up and down there. You can still see the road, you can see the horizon line, so that I had all the major characters and the minor characters, and I thought, okay, I'm going to start watching this as if it's a play and let it go. I did not know at the time I would still be doing it occasionally 30 years later. But it's given me a perspective that's been very useful in a lot of the work that I do. So there's March 31st. Let me take you forward 14 days. Let me take you forward 5 days. 5 days change. There's that kind of drama just in this deciduous forested biome that we live in. Who cares that the dogwood's blooming? Gardens are so often about flowers at the expense of structure and form and framing and mood. I, at the time, had a piece of paper attached to other pieces of paper in a little notebook that went in my pocket. I had a pen to write with, and I made notes when I took these photographs. And I made a note that morning, naively thinking I had lost the depth in my scene. This was May 9th, and it had gotten far enough along that the shadows were strong, and I thought, okay, I'm going to wait till fall, and then the leaves will drop and I'll get the distance again. I took the same shot, that's 7:30 in the morning, took the same shots on the way home. Same day. Now, if I were to say to you, okay, let's forget all the language and the jargon that we know as professionals and just use emotional terms to distinguish those two scenes. We don't do this often enough. Do it for yourself. I learned by watching that it was a lot trickier to catch an egret making an arc with film, but I watched these changes because I'd made a pact with myself to look at it not just in the fair weather, but at all times. I saw the floods. I'd had geography at this university, meteorology, earth science, but being out in the landscape with this plane tree or sycamore and an ash making this arc gave me a frame of reference where I once again could really understand how solstice and equinox move through our landscape. I'd originally asked myself the question of how long would it take for that multiplicity of things and living processes that we sometimes call nature to take that tree out of there. The answer was 13 years. And by the time it was gone, there was a new island from different floods. I learned that winter is the best way to see things. There's a shot this spring. Kind of amazing that this frame that I found and that helped to distinguish the scene is still there. I thought that one of those trees would have fallen in this time. So many trees have. The big difference is now it's very difficult to take that photograph 30 years later without having a car in the image. Very difficult. Whereas 30 years ago, I was very frequently could be out there for 10 minutes at a time, not see a car. It's amazing how much changes in 30 years. But I think, again, whether we're talking about architecture or just composition, having a frame of reference is important to our way of resolving any landscape image, and it is what the art of gardening so often does for us. Whether it is, as Volker was talking this morning about Richard Neutra in the desert, it's still about a frame. It is still something that places us in the larger context, even if what is close at hand is something completely contrived. That study kind of gave me the confidence to say it's such an easy thing to do. Just put a camera out on something, make a few notes, and study how things change. So in 1994, there was a tornado that went through Landenberg. That's just this, little community just north of here. It's in Pennsylvania. And I had known this particular section of woods, for those of you that know plants, this was rich enough that on those slopes there were 3 different native ground orchids, Tipularia, plectrum, and orchis. There were also things like Camelarium luteum. These are not common plants, and so to know that they were on those slopes was a very special, fairly intact, what I'll now call a legacy ecology. And that tornado came through and just opened it up. Sucked a Landenbergian out of his second floor window, dropped that wall of the house on him. He's buried in Landenberg. So that's the kind of stuff that happened. And here I am saying, okay, let's see what happens when we let nature take its course. Anybody ever heard that expression? All right. So forget emerging ecologies. It's the way it's always been and always will be. And here it is. You just stand back and let nature, be he or she, male, female, or indifferent, just kind of take over. So I got myself a point of reference so I could find my way back. So there's July 1994, Watch the Healing. October 1995, April 2000, almost back to the pristine woods that it used to be. 2012, there it is, fixed. This is what happens in the mid-Atlantic, in Landenberg, not too far from Maryland or Delaware or Jersey, if you do nothing now. Now, let's say I'm putting my restoration reclamation hat on. I'm going to go fix that. I'm going to put it back the way it was and create habitat that would once again support Camelarium or those 3 ground orchids. I'm not going to do it with Felco shears. I'm not going to do it without big machinery and a huge amount of disturbance and a lot of money. And this is only maybe 10 acres out of a 6,000 acre preserve. We don't have the means or the will or the methods to do that. But if we wanted to be really looking at how things work, and that's how things work, and we say, okay, how about the difference between 2012 and 2000 if I started now to do it? Less cost, less disruption, less disturbance, less intervention. How about October 1995? Much easier. How about if I had started right then? If I had started then, instead of machinery, and if my goal is I want to stop the infusion or the claiming of this space by so many introduced weeds, which is what happens. Mostly been dominated by introduced weeds, which human beings put there. I could have put low resources into training people to recognize a bittersweet seedling, or this or that, and gone in and watched and carefully edited. It wouldn't have been perfect, but with relatively low resources over a period of time, this woods could have come back to much closer to what I would prefer it be. Not what it should be, but just what I'd prefer it would be, because for me, functionally, I like a place that still has all these things that are related to the local fauna. What are these? You're welcome to use this phrase, but if you use it around me, you have to first agree that we are number one. We are the number one invasive exotic on the planet. We're the only species that goes in and dominates without regard, for the most part, without regard for what the real effect is. And then, when we're not pointing binoculars, we're pointing fingers. Which is, again, the nature trope of man and nature it's bankrupt, it's broken, and if we're serious about all this organic, sustainable, green, blue, or whatever, we need to start working on the idea that if this exists, we're it. It's that old pogo thing. This is what our influence looks like locally. This is back in that same machine, just looking at a Landenberg farmstead, and here is what you might call healthy woods. This is the woodlands, the way they looked around here 40 years ago. That is mostly 20th century introduced weeds that are taking advantage of disturbance caused by whoever owns that barn, or whoever owned the barn before them, who owned the barn before them, right on back to whoever you want to call native. Not exotics, they're natives. So look at the ground layer. This is right up from Philippi Road in Landenberg. So they are cute, aren't they? Look at the ground layer. Christmas fern, why there? They don't eat it. Introduce rubus, why there? Because they don't eat it. I went out there, I've gone in many of these places, walking around here. In many cases, we have no regeneration of trees. Very little regeneration of shrubs. But I'm not about to blame them. But they are part of this new ecology. That is a novel ecology, and you just have to decide if you want it. Because if we do want that, we are going to have a very open landscape in Landenberg 100 years from now. We will not have trees, for example. It won't happen. Without regeneration, it won't happen. But this is not wilderness. This is not virgin nature. This is literally right behind this building. That's the creek. That's White Clay Creek. So what's that? It's the road. There's the railroad. So this is the old county road. This is 1700s. The creek. And this is a railroad, which is 1800s. And that was a Pomeroy branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So too often we are talking about these places as if they're wilderness. It's another one of these great stories. I love the idea. But there is a problem with defining a place where the last best things reside, and it's just the best place to be, except once you get there, it disappears. Because by definition, it's without us. We talk about wilderness, and what we really should be talking about is wildness. This is not wilderness, but there's a lot of wildness in this landscape. There's a lot of chance. There's a lot of happenstance. And again, getting straight with nature, getting straight with the idea of wildness as a renewable resource is something that is the first step in understanding emerging ecologies. It takes 5 to 10 minutes longer to take that machine into Newark from our house in Landenberg than it does to take a very efficient modern vehicle or something a bit older. These are not tricked photographs, unless I tell you nothing's been photoshopped or whatever. That's just pointing a little EV viewfinder Sony into the water in November, coming back from a meeting with Sue Barton at the university. And Sue is here today, I think. Sue and I have worked together on a number of different projects, and I've been delighted to be doing some guest lecturing for her course on plants and human culture for the last 5 or 6 years. It's great because we don't We don't use a template. It is pretty much a paperless course, and we can ask questions that we make up. And I love teaching young people and seeing how people that don't have a firm idea of what nature should be, how they relate to the constant flux. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked them. What direction is the water flowing? Now, before you begin to answer, you cannot use gravity as part of your reasoning. Okay? Forget gravity. Like forget, oh, well, it's lower over there and water always flows downhill. Or it's stiller over here and water usually kind of creates a more placid surface if it's dammed. Forget that stuff. Now, this course on plants and human culture fulfills a multicultural requirement and a science requirement. So out of 50 people each semester, Sue gets maybe 45, 48 that are non-majors. So I got the answer the first year I asked this from a young woman who was a marketing major. So you're all professionals, so you got a leg up on her. So what's the answer? Anybody? It's flowing in that direction, of course. And what she said is, well, these are, by the way, old piers of the Pomeroy Railroad. She said, I think it's flowing in that direction because I see trees that have found refuge behind these piers. I think they've seeded in there. And I think if they had tried to seed in here, they would have been washed away by the inevitable flooding. So she's using reasoning that's process-based. This is what McHarg and his ilk were talking about, but they were looking at it from a great distance, not really getting boots on the ground dirty like this. Looking in at not pristine nature, but an old railscape. That kind of thinking of looking at a system and saying, okay, well, how does that translate into action? Well, let's say you're doing a restoration for the Park Service and you say, love these things, really like from a compositional standpoint, I want a tree there, tree there, a tree there. How much is it going to cost to keep putting those trees there? Because they're not going to stay. No matter what size you put them in, they're going to be wiped out. Put them on the other side, and if you have a lot of patience, all it takes is 3 seeds. If not, you can plant bigger trees and maybe they'll get watered. Process. How do you plant a mile-long, 100-foot tall line of trees? You just let a railroad go derelict and walk away for 60 years, because that's the Pomeroy. Now, a few years ago, Dale Hendricks, who's in this room, Doug Tallamy is speaking tomorrow, a couple others, we were set to go kayak the Susquehanna. And it's 5 or 6 professionals, so it took forever and a million emails to get a day set aside on our calendars. And then it was a day much worse than tomorrow's going to be. It was electrical storms forecast, a bad day to be in a small boat out on the river. But instead of saying, oh, let's just blow it off, and because you couldn't stream things from Netflix then, so you got this day on your hands, what are you going to do with it? And we decided we'd just take a local walk. I was talking about local stuff, we'd take a local walk. So we dropped a car, 2 cars actually, 7 miles out beyond Landenberg and walked 7 miles back into downtown Newark. So this is that walk. There's Doug lugging a big birding lens, and his wife Cindy, Dale, Dale's wife, and David is a landscape architect. And just a few little snippets of things we saw. I love seeing these herons. I don't like seeing them standing in chocolate milk. Why are they? I mean, we've heard some of that this morning. This is not good land use upstream. But the system now responds that way. That bird is still surviving right now. I looked at this, I had 2 semesters of entomology. I said it's a Dobson fly. Doug says it's a fish fly. It's in the same order. The lesson for me is I can get close, but an expert knows differently. And so many of these projects that I've been delighted to work on now, very few offices can afford all of the different disciplines that are necessary to do these well, especially when you're really grappling with things that are changing. So putting together these ad hoc committees where you just bring a lot of knowledge together is where it needs to be. That's where the curricula need to evolve so that one person in the group can say, it's a fish fly, not a Dobson fly. This was my turn to speak up because we're walking along this old railroad right away, and this is wild ginger, Asarum canadense, and that population is doing quite well, thank you. But then we see this, the first of about 4 or 5 populations we saw that day. This is Trillium cernum. If you're focused on so-called native plants, locally indigenous things, this is the only locally indigenous Trillium. Most people who are gardeners don't grow it because the flowers hang down. This is what it looks like. That's a picture taken on a different day. I think that's perfectly acceptable. I mean, from a decorative standpoint, on a 1 to 10 scale, I'm going to give it at least a 7. But it is by ants taking these little things, these little eliosomes that are on the seeds of these trilliums and many other spring ephemerals. For whatever reason, they are burrowing into the shoulder of the old railroad track, and they are planting these trilliums. This trillium, I've watched this for 40 years here. Most of the habitat that I knew this trillium in, it's gone now. Primarily from one introduced grass, Microstegium viminium, is a little Japanese stilt grass, and it's taken over on the flat in most cases. It's not taken over there, so this trillium is increasing. It is not a common species. It is threatened. It's increasing in a cultural landscape. So I was up recently at the New York Botanic Garden, and Rob Knoxley, who was working on the new version of the Gleason and Cronquist manual of the flora of the East. I said, Rob, when you get to Trillium cernum, be sure that you include in the habitat the shoulders of derelict or disused, as the Brits say, disused rail lines, because that's part of modern habitat in this emerging ecology that we're surrounded by. We're finally getting near to Newark, and we're stopping for a moment to admire the latest work by Twerp. This is the old Pomeroy abutment right there. And we look on the other side. This is unsigned. I like this one better. So here's a college kid with a spray can. This is not the Japanese painted fern, Aetherium niponicum. This is Splenium platyneuron, is a local fern. So there it is one year. I'm going to show you a photograph of it next year. I went back and took the same photograph, same fern next year. Is the fern A, dead, B, smaller, C, bigger? How many for A? B? C? Okay. There it is. This year. But you know, we're too often involved with like bigger, smaller. How about why? Why is it there anyway? Anybody? Lime. It likes an alkaline environment. Actually, no, I'm anthropomorphizing. It doesn't like it. It's better adapted to it than other things. It has a competitive advantage for a limey environment. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't know it, but 100 years ago, they were actually setting up a situation where long after the trains have stopped running in 1928, they've created habitat in a niche where this fern, which again is losing its legacy habitat on the ground around here due to introduce weeds, good 4-letter word, they created habitat for it. That's a good thing, see? Now, this business of habitat gets tricky because we're so programmed. I'm going to make sure I get that little clock. We're so programmed to think that certain things are good and bad, and some of them just may be until we know a little bit more. So this is taken with a really little camera. We're walking along the creek in the water, and I see this little green heron, and then I see this, a very unusual rock. Wouldn't you say? Anybody recognize this rock? I couldn't quite make it out from a distance, but I got closer to it, and then I recognized it. Anybody? You're right, Briggs and Stratton. So, okay, we're walking down the creek and we're looking at green herons, and there's a lawnmower in the middle of the creek. And I thought I was in the wilderness, so big time disappointment. And then I look closer. The gas tank, the top has rusted off the top of the gas tank. You know, it's just not built to last. And inside there is a crayfish. The crayfish was there up and back that day, was there when we left. Now, so, A, I am recommending that you throw your old lawnmower in the stream. 2, old lawnmowers are the ideal habitat for crayfish. Or 3, an old lawnmower can be habitat for crayfish in this ecology. That I can say for sure is true. So I went back to look a week later. We had one of those floods that would have wiped out the trees that a well-meaning landscape architect would have put on the front side of those piers, and it took the lawnmower and washed it downstream. So now I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this crayfish has lost its home. I never did find that lawnmower. I mean, we walked that a mile. Emerging ecologies, not a rock, but a green heron. This is our yard in Landenberg. We're high and dry on a hill. This is actually another scan slide from 1986. I'm in South Africa, working for Longwood Gardens, looking to reduce our heating fuel bill, where we're using 250,000 gallons of fuel to heat the conservatories. Pierre Dupont really was not mad about tropicals. He actually was much more of a Mediterranean kind of guy. And over the years, beginning with a tropical botanist who was a director in the 60s, they had kind of shifted to more of a tropical flora under glass, and it was costing a lot of money to heat it. Betty Scholz at Brooklyn Botanic Garden said, you know, the Cape flora, it's 85% endemic. If you were to bring some of that stuff back and grow it under glass, you could probably cut your heating bill by 30%, stuff that wouldn't need nighttime temperatures more than in the upper 30s or very low 40s as compared to 60. And you'd be telling people about a flora that is unique and threatened. So we spent 7 weeks in South Africa in a rented Toyota. That's the Swartberg Mountains. Those are leucadendrons. And on that trip, I knew about this plant. This is Bulbinella. It's related to the lilies. It's in the, it's either the same family as asphodels or the same family as xanthorrheas, but it is a monocot. It's very beautiful. This is Bulbinella latifolia, variety latifolia. But we knew there was an orange form, and we knew that there'd been a great success story. We were with the Botanical Society. The orange form was restricted to one little patch of ground, just about 1,000 acres broad in Newoodville, which is up in the flowering country that they call Namaqualand. And we actually did go to visit a farmer named McGregor. He wasn't that old, but Neil McGregor had sheep. They're all growing sheep there. So he was realizing, and he cared about the flora, and he put it 2 and 2 together and realized that by tradition, he had been letting the sheep out on these acres just before, after these things had flowered, but before the seed had matured. So they're trampling immature seeds and the plants into the ground, and they're declining. So he says, okay, I'm going to wait 3 weeks later. I'm going to just delay putting the sheep out on this patch of ground. I mean, he had 10,000 acres, so he could play with it a little bit. But, so he does that, and we were looking at it 10 years later. Gardening. This is wild gardening. This is the cultural landscape. These are plants that are directly due to somebody making a difference in when they let the sheep out. This is understanding an ecology. Okay, back to the interactive session. How many of you would like this photograph better if the tracks weren't in it? I like the tracks. It's us. I'm happy to be there. This is not a digital artifact. Those are pink flowers, and those are white flowers. Little did I know when I took this photograph in 1986 that I would one day own a 1938 Chevrolet, although mine has a wheel on the other side. So this was moved around there. And what it spoke to me of at the time was just the difference in grazing, letting stuff go, or grazing, turning things upside down, letting it go. Look at the difference. Grazing, nobody planted anything here. Sharon Loving's here today. She might remember some of this stuff. We were looking at the time at Longwood. We were trying to come up with not just the plants, but the signatures, the essence of what made this place. And one of the things was the color signature. And orange and cobalt blue and yellow, we decided that's the color signature of the Cape in bloom. And you could get it from looking at this. And all that was, because Neil was going around showing us, this is just land that had been let fallow for about 5 years. Everything there indigenous, endemic. Melinda and I just came back from Hyde Park. This is Montgomery Place. I just was having a blast because they've got cicadas there by the millions. So it was really hard to stop and take pictures of nature being framed. At least there's a little bit of the cultural landscape in the foreground. But here's an iPhone photograph taken at Gravetie, William Robinson's place. How many of you know who Robinson is or was? Okay, so he's an Irishman who gets to know Charlie Darwin. Charlie recommends him for the Linnaean Society at age 28, and then he goes and writes a bunch of books and makes enough money to accumulate 1,100 acres of land in Sussex and deed it to the country of England. You know, Jane, I know that this is called Ashdown Forest, but to me that looks like a field with a bunch of hedgerows in it. But this is Ashdown Forest, the view off of Gravetie with the formality up near it and looking at the land. Now he writes this book called The Wild Garden in 1870, just about 10, 15 years before he got Gravetie, but he's starting to work on his thesis. He was a very prescient character. He understood that one day there would be such things as keywording. So he's got this tile, he puts all these keywords in, anticipating Google searches many years later. The naturalization and grouping of hardy exotic plants with a chapter on the Garden of British Wildflowers by Robinson. The illustrations by Alfred Parsons. Is that just the woods and a stream? No. It's a highly edited landscape, primroses and daffodils. But what got me about this book, we put this back in print 3 years ago, wrapped in a new book, is this. He's quoting an Anglican minister whose wit and wisdom were published in North America in 1839. I want to read this for emphasis. I went to stay at a very grand and beautiful place in a country where the grounds are said to be laid out with consummate taste. For the first 3 or 4 days I was enchanted. It seemed so much better than nature, there's that word again, with a capital N, just like right, that I began to wish the earth had been laid out according to the latest principles of improvement. That time they were just daffy for tropical and Central American things like Salvia splendens. They were all really well versed in geometry, so they're making these little doily-like arrangements with tropicals and saying it's beautiful. In 3 days' time, I was tired to death. A thistle, a heap of dead bushes, anything that wore the appearance of accident and want of intention was quite a relief. I used to escape from the made grounds and walk upon the adjacent goose common where the cart ruts, gravel pits, bumps, coarse, ungentlemanlike grass, and all the varieties produced by neglect were 1,000 times more gratifying. Robinson makes clear the wild garden is not just about making a mess. It is about allowing a little bit of chance into the landscape. This is a dove tree planted by Robinson in the 1880s. These daffodils are still there. Talk about sustainable. I'd be happy if I could say that I put that plant there and it's been growing there without water, without chemicals, without mechanical maintenance for 130 years. How many of you can say you've done that? I haven't been gardening for that long. That's sustainable. Now, you say, okay, but these are all exotics. They're from the Caucasus and stuff. He's wiped out the British flora. At one time, there used to be, you know, British stuff there. So let me look in between here. Let me go over there and take a picture in between the daffodils. Still there. It's not our trout lily, it's their trout lily. That's Erythronium dens canis. So it's not to say that this always plays nice all the time, but there's many possibilities where you can find a shared footprint. I thought I was going to be an engineer. I started here as an engineer, so I like stuff like this. Robinson actually took those trains. It's now called the Bluebell Railway, named after Robinson for saving the bluebells. But that train, he used to walk 2 miles to the train station and take it to his offices in Covent Garden, take it up to Victoria. They're actually putting this back together now, but it's been running. And anybody here ever heard of a program called Downton Abbey? Okay, well, if you've seen that, you've seen this train many times. Robinson lived to 1935, and in the last couple of years of his life, he was planning on putting the Wild Garden back into print, and he was musing on why he'd written the Wild Garden anyway, and he said, I think the idea occurred to me because I used to take a pocket full of seeds on the train and throw them out the window. That's back when you could open the windows on trains. And so here is Melinda looking out the window, wondering which of these came out of Robinson's pocket. The greatest Robinsonian wild garden in the area is Winterthur, and you'll see Winterthur before this conference is done. This has been there for the better part of a century. It is Robinson's idea. Don't change the lay of the land, don't muck with the grade, allow the forest to be there, but plant hardy exotic things that are adapted. The same footprint later in the season, exact same spots at Winterthur. This is the March Bank in March and then in April. I've been working with a client in Long Island for about 3 years, and I just happened to be there this time in May, and this is partly why they bought this property. It's an old Phipps estate. That's been there. In 10 years, it will have been there 100 years. Nobody has done anything. These are Spanish, English bluebell hybrids. 100 years. So we talk sustainable, talk about infiltration, talk about covering the ground, talk about all these things that get you points in ecosystem service heaven. Good stuff, really good stuff. And pretty too. We felt badly walking on it. Rhododendron camphori at Winterthur. It'll live a century around here. It's not native. How about this? What's native and not? What's contrived and not? Where's nature? That is Wright's work. This, hard to even assign gender to whoever did that. But it was there. Kaufman and Wright, working in Falling Water, left this. Who gets credit for planting those plants? Who gets credit for planting these? Both of them and anybody that bought into that ethic. They're making this house, it's not really a house, it's a place to go visit and be immersed. The exercise of Falling Water really was, how does architecture immerse you and open you up to being able to see experience. I know if I show you the winter shot of the falls, you don't think there's moss under those falls, but there is, and the pattern of the moss changes every year. Melinda and I have been working with Falling Water for about 6 years now in very subtle ways that they can manage things like this that are not supposed to look gardened. They're working with mostly indigenous material, some things naturalized from Lillian Kaufman's time, but a landscape that does need management. But see, here's architecture telling you about layers. You cannot not think about horizontal layers if you're in something like this. Let's say you're in Edgar Kaufman's office, and he did not have a high-speed line or Netflix or any of this stuff, so he's got to look out the window once in a while. And this is what you do. You look out those fabulous Hope windows, and you entertain yourself by looking at the garden, if we're willing to call the garden just a watchful view of our emerging ecology. So now that you know what it looks like in those seasons, what does it look like in winter? You got it? Wright deliberately did this kind of stuff. It's a movie screen. It's about the incidental, about the phenomena. And McCarg knew this. This is just a sweet birch casting dancing shadows or silhouettes on the wall. The Kaufmans got this property in the 1930s. At that time, it was highly degraded. There had been something of a kind of retreat on the property. There was a lot of logging. There was mining in the area. And if you look at these slopes, they're anything but pristine. But one difference is that they stopped all the logging work and they stopped the mining work in the 30s. And so Falling Water regenerated at a time before many of these exotics are there. So if I go walk Falling Water's landscape now, this is the kind of stuff that I see. I see a very, call it healthy, but look at all these oaks on the ground. Go walk the woods around here, anybody that you have time, and see if you see that. Go find a woods that has that kind of regeneration. It's all about time. Falling Water, this stuff is still there because it regenerated at a time before other things came in. You all recognize this? Longwood Gardens. Longwood Gardens and a treehouse, an ADA accessible, non-powered treehouse. It's a good trick. I thought it was a plasma screen. I thought this is where the signal was coming down. But there's a view to the woods, a view to the meadow. They are working now on this. It's not a meadow, really. It's a meadow garden, as Sharon will tell you. We don't really have meadows around here unless we burn it or unless it's really wet. Meadows are pretty much part of the cultural landscape. We certainly don't have prairies here. But these patterns here are all about plants reacting to the conditions on site. Melinda and I have an acre and a half in the suburbs. We don't kid ourselves, it is the suburbs. When we got the place, that's what the view from the toilet looked like. We garden with a lot of indigenous things, but we are by no means exclusively nativist. We do what works. We have our intents. We're looking for certain functions. That is more dull than this. This is a landscape that has no irrigation beyond establishment, no fertilizer beyond our compost pile, no chemicals, no pesticides, no herbicides. There's looking at that same planting from the roof, a river of our local aster, keeping the ground covered, keeping the weeds down. That's what it looks like in autumn. That's what it looks like in November. And because we leave all these seed heads out there, we get regeneration, which helps with our weeding. Because we don't cut things back in winter, if you happen to be a cardinal foraging in our organic accumulation, you'd find things to eat and you'd find cover from hawks. I don't know if we get points for this or not, but if you are in the suburbs and you can be busy people, gardening, enjoying a garden, and still have visits from things like this hermit thrush, something is working. It is not nature, it is the modern ecology. It's a big mix-up, mash-up, but it's working. These are all shots from the window. Melinda, a couple years ago, said, quick, come to the window here, and I took, well, that's in the garden. This is Spigelia marilanica. This shot is over her shoulder. Tony Avon, who has Plant Delights Nursery, is a great friend and a great nurseryman. We're happy to sell you one of these for $15. We have it naturalized in the garden. We brought plants from different provenance in there and just watched until we saw where it went. Now, you've noticed there's nature, right? It's not all sweet and happy. This is our only native hummingbird, and it looks over its shoulder and says, "Death on the wing." Still a nice red flower. We do stuff like this. I wouldn't plant 3 beeches on 6-inch centers, but we choose. So these beeches were things we just left. They regenerated on their own. We left them. They're in the garden, and they are free trees. They do well. We have recently been, for the last few years, allowing this self-seeded border of violet striata to come in there. And as Doug Tallamy will tell you tomorrow, if you like fritillary butterflies, they only eat violets in larval stage. We're happy to celebrate the cultural landscape. This is a little garden shed, a glorified garden house at the back of the garden with a reflection of the kind of tool that used to farm this land. And in the periphery are silver bells seeded in. This is not the woodland silver bell. This is a full sun silver bell from Florida that will be here long after global warming has had another 40 years to go. Because this will take summer heat in Florida, and it grows well here. It's a zone 5 plants, Halesiodiptera magniflora. This is only beyond the bar at the back of the garden. A lot of people don't notice it, fortunately, but this is a little homage to Detroit, which is in trouble. This is a few clips from 30s cars set back there as sculpture. Little did I know that it would be the perfect barometer for when the birch pollen hits its peak. That leopard skin look there is birch pollen. This is not our garden, but let me ask you today, you're all professionals, so, what would you use to plant the engine compartment of a 1951 Lincoln, or foundation plantings? How about Aster divaricatus and Eupatorium rugosum? How about in the engine compartment? Great for the birds, barberry. What else is going to grow up in there? I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it works. This is a junkyard out near Jefferson, Pennsylvania. There are so many birds in that landscape, you've got to shield your eyes. And it is a mashup. Here's an unidentified Chrysler product with Viburnum dentatum, gets native status. Another Chrysler product, a red maple, a Nash with sassafras, a Solidago with Chevy. Here's a black oak with a Studebaker. We're living in a delaminated landscape, like it or not. The layers have been shifted around. They are peeling apart from one another. This is what it means. And Malcolm Gladwell's making a good living off this. It's a lot of unanticipated stuff. GM thinks it's building a car. Ralph Nader thinks he's making a reputation as a writer. Actually, it was all intended to create habitat for alternate leaf dogwood. And there's that same junkyard, there's an alternate leaf dogwood, and Doug can tell you it's all working. Holy leaves, it's working. I'm working with this. I'll be back out here Monday. This is the Cary Furnace site, 450 acres on the east side of the Mon. Plant me a poplar in that. But don't try it from a quart container or a plug. Try it from seed. 1/4 inch of grit. This is the Cary Furnace site. It's a heritage site. Gardeners like container plants. There's container plants. Look at this. No irrigation, no fertilizer, no input. I like this because it works. We don't have the option to do alternatives. But on this site, there's a mix-up. There are thousands of healthy native trees and shrubs, as well as all this other stuff. That is looking at it from a helicopter in May. I went back on the ground in July and took this. Pete Outhoff and Noel Kingsbury used this photograph in their new book, Plantings, 22-inch wide spread. Nothing there has been planted. Everything there is a weed. It's growing in concrete rubble, and there's 100 acres of this. It's pretty. My role has been to say, could you just adjust your planning, because Rivers of Steel is a not-for-profit working with this. Adjust your planning, put a dollar figure on these 40-foot tall, healthy sycamores and ashes and oaks. Well, not the ashes anymore. iPhone photograph inside with a young student from SCAD looking at something she sees as beautiful. I'm intrigued because 60 feet up, I see again, Aster divaricatus and Eupatorum rugosum are growing on grit inside the furnace. So, Rob, when you do Gleason and Cronquist, better put that as habitat, because sure enough, there's the proof. Sue Barton, Gary Schwetz, and I worked on the Vegetation Concept and Planning Manual for Enhancing Delaware Highways. We learned a lot working with the 10,000 acres of roadside right-of-way that make up this small state of Delaware. I was recently reviewing this. This is a 12-year-old digital aerial. They were mowing this. They were mowing about 10, 15 acres over here. We said, just stop. You're wasting fuel mowing on the far side of this. But that is in like 1998 that we said do that. Here's a photograph from this past fall. It's pretty. Doug and I used this in this new book coming out next year to illustrate a novel ecology. What's the red? It's not red maples. It's calorie pear. Your tax dollars at work. It will be on the most wanted list for those people that do believe in invasive exotics. All you have to do is just drive the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. This tree will take over the world. Now, the point here, though, is that let's say we had started that project in 1935 instead of 1998, and we turned this loose, we wouldn't have gotten this tree. And we'd have a relatively intact legacy forest there. This is the University of Delaware. They picked up recently more than 250 acres of the Chrysler site, and there are a number of us that are doing an experiment. Does that look like an experiment? This is Greg Sachs aerials. That's where they used to, the Durangos that were assembled here went out there onto these lines and shipped across the country. We took these in the interim time between that site becoming cleared and when it is built up as the energy campus, and used these as built-in test sites. First year we're out there, it's already useful habitat. These killdeer are saying, look, I got a broken wing, come over here, don't go near my nest. It's already habitat. There's quite a bit growing there. And we don't know exactly why this stuff grows the way it does, how the water moves over this site. But there's certainly a lot of ecosystem services being produced here by things that are not necessarily PC. That's native, so that's good. How about Germany? They're so far ahead of us with some of this stuff. This is a sorting yard from Berlin, dates to 1899. They stopped the trains from going west at the Second World War. It goes derelict, and it becomes a nature preserve. Art is the nearest neighbor to wildness. This is what it looks like. 300,000 visitors a year. They don't have 2 columns for life. They just talk about life on that site. 366 species of vascular plants, 28 breeding birds, 208 wild bees and wasps. Go figure. If you're young and blind and can't read, you can look at pictures, you can learn about spiders and how all that works. This beats our LEED Platinum standards. They took ballast from the site, not for anything from off the site, tamped it into selected tracks, and made permeable walkways. Nothing comes onto the site, nothing leaves the site. All of these birches, for them, they get local native status, none of them planted, none of them watered, none of them pesticided or herbicided. It's pretty. They're celebrating pattern. They're celebrating regeneration. No railing on the path. They have developed a culture there where they allow people to write, and people do. And it's good, because there's competition. Their big problem is our red oak, which we have problems with here, is a weed over there. So, would you trade places? There are these landscapes that are bringing wildness in. This is Peter Lott's work in Duisburg. Here's wildness, here's order. If humans need order, put some order in, get them oriented, but don't wipe out the wildness. Don't wipe out so much that is free. There's a child taking his parent, let the father out of the stroller for a minute, but there is wildness at the edge. It's a completely resolvable landscape. You want to play with different levels of resources? Take these old impoundments, look at them on the ground. They're all walled gardens now. There's one. Here's another. Here's another. To suit different tastes. Functional in different ways. They've made a bar out of the transformer room. It's open at night. They have one more light show per night than Longwood. We are inventing new places like the High Line in New York, which are about wildness ostensibly. That's what it looked like 12 years ago. That's what it looked like 12 years ago. 12 years ago, 12 years ago, before $185 million was spent. Natives to exotics, 82.79, not too bad. Here's after $180 million, and I do love this landscape, but it's the highest maintenance park in New York. Now, they do get 6 million people walking in a year, and so for a mile, that's pretty good. There's a bit of wildness there. It's introducing a wild aesthetic, but this is really what people like best still, the lawn. They open it for 2 days and close it for 2 weeks, open it for 2 days, close it for 2 weeks. That's what the High Line looked like before anything was done. They're still toying with the idea of some wildness at the end of it. But we haven't come to terms with the difference between nature and us and the other. And I think there's a lot of potential to say, can we look a little bit deeper into the resiliency that's out there, the constant flux that has meaning, has methods, has function, and bring it into our work. This is what I'd like to call a native New Yorker on the third section of the High Line. Thank you.